The sun dipped low over the village of Irawa, gilding the red earth and tall palm trees in golden light as the story of Abani began. She was born into a family that people spoke of with reverence. Her father, Adikunal, was known for his wisdom in settling disputes, and her mother, Omalara, was admired for her healing hands and kindness. Their land stretched far beyond the riverbank, filled with fruit trees and singing birds. The family home stood proudly at the heart of the village, its walls carved with symbols of peace and lineage. Abani grew up surrounded by songs, stories and laughter. Her childhood was painted with warmth and love. Her parents often told her that a family's true wealth was not in gold or land but in the way it treated others. She took those words deeply into her heart, never knowing how soon she would have to test them. Tari, her cousin, was a constant presence in her youth. He was older by a few years and had been brought into their home after his own parents died. To young Abani he was a brother, a friend and at times a protector. They ran barefoot through the fields, caught fireflies at dusk, and listened to tales under the moon. Tari was quiet but observant, always watching, always calculating. Abani never noticed how his eyes lingered too long on the storerooms filled with yams or on the papers her father kept in his study. At that time, love blinded her to his small acts of envy, the way he tightened his jaw when her father praised her, or how he smirked when elders called her the family's shining light. Years passed and Abani blossomed into a graceful young woman. She inherited her mother's calm spirit and her father's sharp mind. She could read the old proverbs and recite the laws of inheritance that her father taught her. The villagers respected her, and the young men admired her quiet confidence. Tari too grew into a man, but with that came a darker edge. His charm was polished like a blade, his words sweet yet hollow. He began to speak of ambition, of taking what one deserved, and Abani often found herself uneasy in his company though she couldn't explain why. When sickness struck her parents, it came swiftly and without mercy. Within a few weeks, both her father and mother were gone, leaving Abani in a grief so deep she could barely speak. Tari took charge of the funeral, his tone clipped and authoritative, his eyes dry. He comforted her in front of the villagers, speaking of unity and duty, but when night fell and the mourners left, his voice turned cold. He began locking rooms, counting livestock, and whispering with the family elders about responsibilities and paperwork. Abani, too heartbroken to argue, let him handle the affairs, trusting that family blood meant loyalty. But soon she noticed changes. The servants who once answered to her now bowed to Tari. The ledgers were kept out of her reach. Even the keys to her father's study disappeared. When she asked, Tari smiled with a face that no longer felt familiar. "It's for your own good, little sister," he said. "The world can be cruel to a woman alone. Let me take care of things." His words dripped with mock concern, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed him. In the following months, the house that once felt like home began to feel like a stranger's. Tari's laughter echoed through halls once filled with her parents' voices. He hosted gatherings, spoke with authority, and sat in her father's chair during council visits. The elders praised his leadership, believing he acted in Abani's interest, while she stood silently in the background, her inheritance, both land and legacy, slipping away like sand through her fingers. Sometimes at night, Abani would wander to the courtyard, her gaze drawn to the stars her mother once told her held the souls of the departed. She would whisper to them, asking if they could see what had become of their home. Her heart ached with confusion. How could someone she once called brother become so different? The bond of their childhood had rotted into something poisonous, and she could feel it tightening around her life. Yet deep within her sorrow, a quiet ember of strength remained. Though Tari held the keys and power, she still held something he could never possess. The truth of who she was and the love her parents had instilled in her. It was that silent promise to their memory that kept her standing, even as her world tilted under the weight of betrayal. The days following the funeral were heavy with silence. The drums that had once celebrated Abani's father's wisdom now rested cold and untouched. The smoke of morning fires had barely lifted when whispers began to crawl through the village like snakes in tall grass. They spoke of a will, a document her father had supposedly written before his death, declaring how his vast lands and possessions should be divided. The elders remembered him mentioning it in passing, and even a few traders swore they had heard him speak about ensuring Abani's future. But when the time came to bring the document forward, Tari stood tall in the courtyard, his expression carved with feigned sorrow, and announced that tragedy had swallowed the proof. He claimed that a fire had broken out in the study on the night after her father's passing, consuming letters, scrolls, and records. He pointed to a charred section of the wall as evidence, a place where the paint had blackened conveniently but nothing else around it was touched. The villagers stood uncertain, torn between belief and suspicion. Some muttered that fire did not spread in straight lines, that the house had not smelled of smoke, but none dared speak too loudly. Tari was, after all, the man now managing the estate. Ebony, lost in her grief, could barely comprehend the full weight of what was happening. Her eyes were red and weary, her days passing in a haze of morning rituals and prayers. When she asked gently about the will, Tari placed a comforting hand on her shoulder and sighed deeply. "Sister," he said, voice heavy with false regret, "if the spirits intended for the will to survive, they would have spared it. Perhaps this is their way of telling us to trust one another." He looked at her with the same soft smile he once wore in childhood, and she wanted to believe him, wanted to think her cousin would never deceive her. But the uneasy flicker in his gaze told another story. Soon the household began to change. Tari started sitting in her father's chair during meetings with visitors. He began signing his name on trade receipts and speaking to workers as though the land had always been his. The family crest, once proudly displayed above the main door, was quietly taken down and replaced with a new carving bearing only his initials. When Ebony noticed, he dismissed it as a necessary modernization, his tone sharp enough to silence any question. In the village square, the whispers grew louder. The girl should have inherited, some women murmured as they fetched water. The land was her father's pride. But others shook their heads and said, "What can a young woman do against a man who holds the documents?" The men who might have spoken for her turned their eyes away. Tari had begun giving out small favors, bags of grain, small coins, promises of work. The air in the village thickened with unease, and those who had once smiled at Ebony now lowered their voices when she passed. Nights were the hardest. Ebony often sat by her mother's clay lamp, its flame dim and trembling like her hope. The memories of her father teaching her about fairness, about truth, haunted her. She remembered the sound of his voice saying, "If ever you lose everything, let honesty be the light that guides you back." But in those dark hours, honesty felt powerless against the machinery of deceit that Tari had built. One evening, when the moon was veiled by clouds, she crept into her father's old study. The air smelled of ash, just as Tari claimed, but when she knelt by the burnt patch on the floor, she saw that the ashes were too clean, too shallow. The wood underneath was barely scorched. Her breath caught. Someone had lit a small flame just long enough to leave a mark, just enough to tell a lie. She ran her fingers along the shelves, hoping for something, anything her father might have hidden, but found only emptiness where documents once lay. Outside, she could hear Tari laughing with guests, his voice bold and confident. The man who had once shared mangoes with her by the river now toasted to his new responsibilities as head of the household. Each laugh echoed through the walls, sharp as a knife carving her name out of her own legacy. The next morning, the village elders came to bless the land in her father's memory. Tari stood beside them, offering generous gifts and speaking of unity. Ebony watched from the shadows, her hands trembling with quiet rage. She wanted to cry out, to tell them what she had seen, but who would listen to a young woman's accusation without proof? The will was gone, the power had shifted, and Tari had woven a net of influence that silenced every whisper of truth. In the following weeks, her days turned hollow. She helped in the gardens, visited the graves of her parents, and smiled politely at villagers who now pitied her. But beneath that calm mask, something within her began to harden. Every deceitful smile Tari gave her, every lock that clicked shut behind her, only fed a small spark growing in her heart, the need for justice, not revenge. She did not yet know how she would find it, but she felt it waiting, somewhere in the unseen corners of her father's house, like a sleeping truth that refused to die. The ancestral house, once filled with music, laughter, and the aroma of her mother's cooking, had become a place of hollow echoes and long shadows. Tari now occupied the grand chambers, the rooms with wide windows and silk curtains that swayed in the afternoon breeze. He walked through the halls like a king surveying his conquered land. Ebony, on the other hand, was moved to the old servant quarters at the back of the compound, a small mud-walled room with a leaking roof and a cracked window that let in the cold night air. He told her it was temporary, that the main house needed rearranging, but she could see the truth in the smug tilt of his smile. It was his way of showing her who truly held power now. The servant quarters were separated from the main house by a narrow path lined with withering flowers. Once, her mother had tended to those flowers every morning, humming softly as she watered them. Now their petals drooped and their scent was replaced by the damp odor of neglect. At night, when the wind swept through the compound, the dry leaves scraped against the walls like whispers of the past. Ebony tried to fill her days with purpose. She swept the little courtyard, fed the chickens, and helped the older servants who still remained loyal to her family's memory. Some of them, like Mama Decca, the oldest among them, would shake their heads and mutter, "The house has lost its soul, my child. Ever since your father's passing, the spirits have grown restless." Ebony wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but even she couldn't ignore the strange things that began happening after she moved. At night, she would hear doors creaking open in the distance, though she knew she had locked everything. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly through the compound, slow and deliberate as if someone, or something, was walking just beyond sight. Her lamp often flickered for no reason, the flame bending sharply toward the window as though pulled by an unseen breath. Once, when she looked up from her bed, she thought she saw a figure at the far end of the path between her room and the main house. It was motionless, shrouded in shadow, watching. But when she blinked, it was gone. During the day, the atmosphere was no better. Tari's new servants, chosen from outside the family, treated her with a cold politeness that carried an undercurrent of mockery. They whispered when she passed, their laughter clipped short as soon as she turned. The few who had served her parents kept their distance, fear written plainly across their faces. When Ebony tried to speak to them, they lowered their eyes and said softly, "Please, miss, do not ask questions. It is better not to know." One afternoon, while helping Mama Decca gather laundry, Ebony mentioned hearing footsteps in the night. The old woman froze, her hands tightening on the cloth. "You must not wander after sunset," she warned. "This house holds secrets that prefer the dark. And whatever you do, child, do not go into the attic." Her eyes darted toward the upper windows of the main house. "It's been locked for years. Some say your father sealed it himself after hearing voices there. Others say he hid something, a thing Tari should never find." That night, Ebony couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed Mama Decca's words again and again. What could her father have hidden? She sat by the window, staring at the attic's faint outline above the main house. A pale light shimmered briefly through the cracks, too steady to be the moon, too faint to be a lantern. Her breath caught. Was someone inside? A rustling sound came from the garden. She stepped out, clutching her shawl tightly, and saw the flowers tremble though there was no wind. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I am my father's daughter," she whispered to herself, "and no shadow can scare the truth from me." The fear in her chest began to transform into something different, resolve. As the nights passed, the strange occurrences continued. Doors opened by themselves, the air grew cold in certain corners of the compound, and sometimes she heard a faint humming that resembled her mother's lullaby. But instead of running, Ebony began to listen. She started keeping a small notebook, writing down every sound, every flicker, every whisper. It was her quiet rebellion, a record of what Tari wanted her to forget. Tari noticed her calmness and mistook it for defeat. He didn't know that while he basked in false power, Ebony was growing stronger in silence. Each night she looked at the attic, feeling that the truth she sought was somewhere behind those locked doors, waiting for her to be brave enough to uncover it. The ancestral home might have been filled with shadows, but within Ebony, a light had begun to stir, small, steady, and unyielding. Tari's rise was swift, calculated, and cruelly elegant. The same cousin who once chased crickets with bare feet now wore embroidered robes, gold-studded sandals, and a mask of confidence that made people forget where he had come from. He began visiting the elders one by one, bearing expensive gifts, sacks of yam, jars of palm wine, bolts of fine cloth from distant markets. At first, the elders hesitated, murmuring that Atakunal's estate should have been shared with his daughter. But Tari's silver tongue worked like honey laced with venom. He spoke of duty, of carrying on the family name, of protecting Ebony as a beloved sister. His words wrapped the truth in layers of charm until even the wise nodded in approval. Soon, Tari was invited to sit among men twice his age at the council gatherings. The same elders who had once sought Atakunal's counsel now sought Tari's. They praised his modern thinking, and admired how efficiently he managed the land. Fields that had always belonged to Ebony's family were now referred to as Tari's holdings. Traders addressed letters to him, and when travelers stopped by, he welcomed them as master of the house, his name spoken with growing reverence. The village, eager to align with the rising sun, began to forget that Ebony was the true heir. Then came the marriage. Tari took a wife from a powerful neighboring family, a woman named Adana, daughter of a wealthy chief. Her arrival was celebrated with feasts that lasted for days, music echoing through the same courtyard where Ebony had once danced as a child. The people cheered, and even those who had once whispered doubts about Tari now sang his praises. Ebony stood at a distance, watching the celebrations unfold like a dream she was not part of. Her cousin, glowing with pride, paraded through the village with his new bride, showering gifts upon the crowd, while Ebony's eyes filled with quiet disbelief. She was given no invitation to the main ceremony. Instead, she was told to help prepare food with the servants. The humiliation burned like acid beneath her skin. Even the younger workers, emboldened by Tari's favor, began to mock her with snide remarks. "Be careful not to drop the plates, Madame Beggar," one said laughing. Ebony bit her lip and said nothing, for she had learned that words could be used against her just as easily as silence could protect her. Her days became smaller, confined to the servant quarters and the edges of the compound where no one looked twice. She no longer attended village gatherings. When she walked through the market, people who had once bowed to her father now turned away, embarrassed or indifferent. She was the girl whose family's wealth had vanished, the woman who lived in the shadow of her cousin's success. Children whispered behind her back. Adults pitied her but did nothing. At night, she often stood outside, staring at the stars. She thought of her parents, how proud they had been, how much they had trusted Tari, and how easily their name was now being erased. The signboard at the entrance to their land had even been replaced. It once read the House of Adacunnel, now it bore only the House of Tari. The first time she saw it, she had felt her throat tighten, but she refused to cry. Crying, she decided, was what Tari wanted, to see her broken and helpless. Yet the struggle within her was constant. There were days when she wanted to scream, to storm into the council and demand justice. But another part of her, the part her father had nurtured, whispered patience. "The truth does not rush," he used to say. "It waits for the right moment to be seen." So she waited, silently, painfully, watching as the web of deceit grew thicker. Tari's power extended beyond land and wealth. He began to influence the courts of neighboring villages. With Adana's father supporting him, he gained allies who saw him as a man destined for leadership. When disputes arose, people sought his judgment, and he delivered it with the arrogance of a self-made ruler. Ebony could not deny his cleverness. It was almost frightening how easily he mimicked her father's wisdom, twisting it into something cold and manipulative. There were moments, alone in the dark, when despair gripped her. She would look at her reflection in the small cracked mirror by her bed and wonder who she had become. Was she still the daughter of Adacunnel, or merely a shadow cast by Tari's ambition? Some nights she clenched her fists, whispering prayers that her parents' spirits would give her strength. Other nights she thought of leaving, walking away from it all, disappearing into another village where no one knew her story. But then she would think of her father's land, the trees he planted with his own hands, the stories carved into the walls of their home, and she knew she could not abandon them. Her dignity was all she had left, and she clung to it with quiet ferocity. Though she was treated like a beggar, she refused to beg. Though mocked, she refused to bow. Deep inside, beneath layers of sorrow and humiliation, something unbreakable remained, a determination so steady that even Tari's growing empire could not extinguish it. For every deceitful word he spoke, for every sneer he threw her way, Ebony silently vowed that one day, somehow, truth would return to claim its rightful place. "You said." The market was alive with color and sound that morning, vendors calling out prices, the sharp scent of spices and roasted corn hanging in the air, the laughter of children chasing one another between stalls. It had been weeks since Ebony last allowed herself among crowds. Most days she preferred solitude, the quiet hum of her thoughts safer than the judgmental whispers of people who had accepted Tari's version of the truth. But that morning something drew her there, a restless pull as if the wind itself urged her to step beyond her exile. She carried a small basket of groundnuts, her only source of income now, and stood in the corner of the square, hoping to make enough to buy oil and salt. People passed by without a glance, some pretending not to recognize her, others offering pitying smiles. She was about to leave when an old man, tall and wrapped in a faded cloak, stopped in front of her stall. His beard was silver white, his walking stick carved with strange patterns. His eyes, though clouded with age, had a sharpness that seemed to look straight into her soul. He bought a handful of groundnuts, dropped a few extra coins in her basket, and studied her for a moment longer than was polite. "You are Adacunnel's daughter," he said finally, his voice rough but certain. Ebony's breath caught. Few called her by her father's name anymore. She nodded, surprised. "I was a trader once," the man continued, "and I shared palm wine with your father long before your cousin grew his first beard. He was a man of honor." His tone softened, tinged with regret. But honor often leaves no footprints when deceit walks behind it. Ebony looked down, her throat tightening. My father's honor was stolen, she whispered. Everything he built is now in another's name. The old man leaned closer, his eyes glinting with something that felt like knowing. Things built in truth cannot be destroyed, he said slowly. They can only be hidden. Sometimes the truth hides not in the ground, but in the dust of forgotten rooms. She frowned, trying to grasp his meaning. What do you mean, Baba? But the man only smiled faintly, tapping his walking stick twice on the ground before turning to leave. Your father was a careful man, he said over his shoulder. Too careful to let fire consume his legacy. And with that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Ebony standing amid the noise and colors of the market, her heart pounding. The words clung to her mind long after he was gone. The dust of forgotten rooms. She repeated them silently as she walked home under the fading sun. Her steps grew quicker, her pulse louder. Forgotten rooms? The phrase echoed through her memory until it struck her like a spark. The attic. The one place she had been told never to enter. The room sealed and whispered about. Could that be what he meant? That night, she sat in her small quarters staring at the silhouette of the main house. It loomed dark and quiet against the sky, its upper windows reflecting the moonlight like cold eyes. She thought of her father's study, of the two perfect ashes Tari had shown her. What if her father had hidden the will, or something even more important, where no one would think to look? Her mind raced with questions. Why had the old man appeared now? How did he know? Was it mere chance or something guided by the spirits her mother used to speak of? Ebony wasn't sure, but the uncertainty only fed her resolve. For the first time in months she felt something stir inside her, a pulse of courage, warm and steady. The following morning she began to observe the house from a distance. Tari had grown comfortable in his control, often leaving for days to attend council meetings or visit his wife's family. The servants moved about lazily, their routines predictable. Ebony noticed that the attic's small window was never opened, its shutters nailed from the outside long ago. But one evening as the sun began to sink, she saw a faint glimmer between the wooden slats, something reflecting light as though a mirror or a metal object had caught the last ray of the sun. That sight confirmed her suspicions. Her father had hidden something there, something Tari didn't know about, or couldn't access. Her heart raced as she made a plan. She would wait until Tari was gone again, then find a way in. The attic might hold nothing but dust and memories, but it might also hold the truth that would bring back her name, her dignity, and her father's legacy. When Tari returned that evening, he passed her by in the courtyard, throwing her a careless glance. Still here? He muttered, half smiling. You could at least thank me for letting you stay on my land. Ebony bowed her head slightly, her voice calm. I am grateful, cousin. He chuckled and walked away, unaware that behind her lowered gaze, her eyes burned with determination. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees, Ebony whispered to herself, the dust of forgotten rooms. The phrase had transformed into a promise. She could almost feel her father's presence guiding her, the same way he used to guide her hand when teaching her to write. Her fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her. Beneath the grief, beneath the betrayal, a spark of purpose glowed bright. Some truths, she thought, are like seeds. They may be buried, trampled, forgotten, but given time and courage, they always find a way to break the ground and see the light again. The moon hung low that night, veiled by restless clouds that drifted across the sky like watchful spirits. Ebony waited until the household had gone quiet, until even the owl's cries faded into the distant woods. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and slipped out of the small servant quarters, her bare feet silent against the cold ground. The ancestral home stood ahead, its once proud frame now sagging beneath years of neglect and Tari's careless reign. She hesitated only for a breath, then pressed her palm to the old wooden door. It creaked open like a sigh from the past. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and forgotten years. Shadows clung to the corners, and the scent of old smoke lingered, perhaps from the fire Tari claimed had destroyed her father's will. Each step Ebony took stirred faint echoes of her childhood laughter, ghostly reminders of days when this house had been filled with light and love. Now only silence answered her. She moved through the corridors, her lantern flickering softly. The portraits on the walls watched her with hollow eyes, their painted smiles seeming to fade in disapproval. When she reached the narrow staircase that led to the attic, her hand trembled slightly. The old servants had warned her never to go there, said it was cursed, said her father's spirit roamed above, restless and unsatisfied. But fear no longer ruled her. It had been replaced by something sharper, determination. Each creaking step felt like a question, each shadow a secret. The door to the attic was swollen with age, its hinges moaning as she pushed it open. A gust of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of ink and cedar. Her lantern's light revealed a world frozen in time. Dust coated everything like a second skin. Old trunks, broken furniture, faded letters tied with strings, and torn books lay scattered across the floor. A cobweb clung to her hair as she ducked beneath a wooden beam. Then her eyes caught the glint of something faintly golden near the far wall. A box, half buried beneath a pile of cloth and old documents. It bore the carved insignia of her father's seal, a rising sun enclosed in a circle of leaves. Her breath caught. She knelt, brushing the dust away. The box was heavy, its lock rusted but firm. She tried to pry it open, but it would not yield. Her fingers trembled as she traced the emblem, remembering her father's words from long ago. Truth is never destroyed, Ebony. It only hides, waiting for brave hands. The attic felt alive now. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden frame. A faint murmur echoed through the rafters, like a sigh or a warning. Her lantern flickered once, twice, then steadied. She turned and saw a portrait leaning against the wall, its canvas cracked with age. It was her parents standing side by side. Her father's eyes seemed almost real, filled with warmth and quiet pride. Her mother's painted hand rested over a rolled parchment, the kind used for wills and land records. The coincidence made her shiver. She stepped closer, her heart racing. "Mother?" she whispered, though she knew there would be no reply. Still, the air felt charged, as though unseen eyes watched her from beyond the walls. She knelt again, sliding the box into her shawl. The metal clasp snagged against the fabric, but she secured it close to her chest. The attic floorboards groaned beneath her as she turned to leave. Halfway down the stairs, a sound stopped her cold, a soft click like footsteps behind her. She froze, listening. Only the wind moved, whispering through the cracks in the walls. But then came another noise, a faint thud as if something, or someone, had shifted in the attic. Ebony didn't look back. She clutched the box tighter and descended faster, her breath sharp, her pulse drumming in her ears. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she blew out her lantern to avoid detection. The moonlight spilling through the hallway windows guided her path. Every creak of the floor felt deafening, every movement a risk. If Tari discovered her in the main house at this hour, he would find a way to punish her, perhaps even accuse her of theft or madness. She slipped through the corridor, her eyes darting toward the courtyard beyond the doorway. A shadow passed across the veranda, Tari's hound, perhaps, or one of the guards he had hired to protect his ill-gotten wealth. Ebony crouched low, waiting until the figure vanished. The night wrapped around her like a cloak, its silence both ally and threat. Finally she reached the back exit. The wooden door opened with a reluctant groan. She stepped out into the cool night air, her heart still hammering. The stars seemed brighter than before, as if watching her daring act unfold. She didn't stop until she was back inside her small quarters, door barred, chest heaving. Ebony set the box on the table, her lantern trembling slightly in her hands as she relit it. The seal glimmered faintly in the glow. She touched it with reverence, whispering a prayer of gratitude to her ancestors. Whatever lay within, she knew it was meant for her to find. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a small smile. Beneath the dust and the fear, hope had returned, quiet, steady, unyielding. Somewhere in that sealed box lay the truth Tari had tried to bury. And now, the night had given it back to her. The dawn crept slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. Ebony had not slept a moment. The box sat before her on the small wooden table, its brass lock glinting faintly in the early light. Her hands hovered over it, trembling with equal parts fear and anticipation. For so long she had lived with questions, about her parents' deaths, about Tari's lies, about the whispering servants who had gone silent when she entered a room. Now all that she had lost, all that had been taken, seemed to rest within this small sealed chest. After several attempts with an old hairpin and the sharp edge of a kitchen knife, she heard a faint click. The lock yielded. The lid creaked open, and a faint scent of cedar and ink drifted into the air, familiar and distant, like her father's study. Inside lay a few personal trinkets: her mother's carved ivory comb, a faded ribbon that once held her braids, and beneath them, an oilskin-wrapped bundle tied neatly with a strip of red cloth. Ebony's heart stuttered. She untied it carefully, her breath quickening as the crackle of aged parchment filled the room. The letter was folded several times over, its edges browned by time but still intact. The handwriting was unmistakable, broad, deliberate, and graceful, exactly as she remembered her father's. At the top of the page, the words gleamed faintly in the morning light. Last will and testament of Chief Adewale of the Oyo line. Her throat tightened. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the familiar signature. The paper confirmed everything. Her father had indeed left behind a will, and it was witnessed and sealed by 3 respected elders of the village. The ink, though faded, was still legible. It named her Abeni as the sole heir to the Adewale lands, titles and wealth. It mentioned her father's trust in her wisdom, her fairness, and her courage to protect their lineage. She covered her mouth, stifling a sob. The weight of injustice she had carried for so long seemed to lift, if only slightly. But as she read on, her trembling hands froze again. There was another page, folded beneath the first, something her father had written in secret, a letter to her. "If you are reading this, my daughter," it began, "then the shadows I feared have come to pass." Abeni's eyes moved quickly over the words. Her father spoke of betrayal, of deceit within their kin. He wrote of Tari's growing greed and the suspicion that his accidents were not accidents at all. He had discovered forged land papers, bribes given to elders, and secret dealings with foreign merchants who sought to buy ancestral land illegally. "He will come for what is not his," her father had written. "But know this, truth is the sharpest blade. Use it when the time comes." Abeni's pulse pounded in her ears. She unfolded the final sheet, a set of signed documents listing Tari's fraudulent transactions, stamped with official marks. It was undeniable evidence of his theft and corruption. Her father had hidden it, knowing that if Tari found it, all proof would vanish forever. Her hands trembled as she laid the documents on the table. Each line felt like a heartbeat from the past, a whisper of her father's guidance reaching through time. She realized that this paper was more than a testament, it was power. It was her inheritance, yes, but also her weapon. A single sheet of parchment that could topple Tari's empire of lies. But along with power came fear. She looked toward the small window where the sunlight now streamed through. Tari would not sit idle if he discovered that she held proof of his crimes. He would crush her before the truth could spread. Still, a calm strength began to rise within her. She could almost hear her father's voice. "The truth, my daughter, is not meant to sleep forever. When the right dawn comes, wake it." She gathered the papers, wrapped them once more in the oilskin, and pressed them to her chest. The warmth of her skin met the cool parchment. It felt like a promise exchanged between generations. For hours she sat in silence, thinking. Every memory of humiliation, every cruel laugh from Tari's wife, every time she had been denied food or voice, all those wounds began to harden into resolve. The paper before her was not just proof. It was justice waiting to breathe. Abeni took out a small clay lamp and lit it. The flame burned steady, illuminating her face with quiet determination. She whispered softly, "Father, you trusted me with this. And I will not fail you." She folded the will back into its wrappings and hid it beneath a loose floorboard beneath her bed. Then, sitting upright, she planned her next move. She could not simply accuse Tari. He controlled the elders, the records, the guards. If she moved too soon, he would destroy the papers and silence her forever. No, she thought, she would need to be clever. The truth would not be shouted from rooftops, it would be whispered into the right ears at the right time. As the morning grew brighter, Abeni stepped outside and faced the rising sun. The light kissed her face, soft but fierce, as if blessing her for what she had found. In her heart, the grief of years transformed into something stronger, a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. The will, the evidence, and her father's final words had given her something she had thought forever lost: control over her own fate. The paper of power had turned her from a victim into a challenger. And soon, it would turn the tables on Tari and everyone who had conspired against her. The air in the village had grown heavy with unease. Word had spread quickly as it always did, but this time the whispers carried venom. Tari had moved fast, faster than Abeni could have anticipated. He had called a gathering of the elders and the most influential families, weaving a story so convincing that even those who remembered her father's honor paused in doubt. Abeni, who had been gathering water at the well, first heard it from the market women. "She is bewitched," one of them whispered, eyes wide. "They say she can curse the crops, the children, the river itself." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Bewitched? Witchcraft? It was a word that carried more weight than mere accusation. It carried fear, danger, and the potential for death. Her mind raced. Tari had always been cunning, but this was a new level of cruelty. He had not only stolen her inheritance but had now painted her as a threat to the village itself. Abeni hurried back to her quarters, clutching the oilskin-wrapped papers tightly against her chest. The box from the attic had been more than just a hiding place. It had been a lifeline. Now it was the only thing that could prove her innocence and her rightful claim, yet she could not show it, not here, not yet. One wrong move, one glance at the wrong person, and she could be taken in chains, tried before a biased court, and perhaps executed under the guise of superstition. That evening a crowd gathered in the central square. Torches cast flickering shadows against the mud-walled houses, and the scent of smoke hung thick in the humid air. Ebony stayed at the edges, hidden behind a tree, observing the scene. The elders sat in their ceremonial chairs, faces grave, while Tari stood before them, speaking with the authority of a man convinced of his own righteousness. His words were sharp, laced with fear and manipulation. "We cannot ignore the omens," he said. "The girl's presence brings misfortune. Witness the dying crops, the river running low, and the strange happenings at night. This is no coincidence. She practices forbidden arts. She must answer for her actions." The crowd murmured uneasily. A few villagers whispered that it was true they had seen shadows moving unnaturally in the old servant quarters, or that Ebony's quiet defiance of Tari's rule had caused strange occurrences, but most were unsure. Fear had a way of silencing reason. Ebony's fists clenched around the paper beneath her shawl. The words her father had written, the signatures of the elders, the proof of Tari's deceit, it was all hidden, yet all she had. She could feel the power of it, a latent force waiting for the right moment. She thought of the flames in her father's study, of the charred wall that Tari had claimed destroyed the will. All of it had been a trap, a test, and now if she moved recklessly, it could be the end. One of the younger servants approached her quietly. "Miss, you should not be here," he whispered. "Tari, he plans to bring you before the elders at first light. If they find you with anything, any evidence, you will not walk free." Ebony nodded, her mind racing. She retreated to the shadow of a nearby building, heart pounding, eyes scanning the crowd for faces that might offer sympathy. Few did. Most villagers now avoided her gaze, unsure whether to fear or pity her. The social and spiritual stakes were inseparable. Accusation of witchcraft was not just superstition. It was a weapon, a tool to maintain control. Tari wielded it masterfully, bending belief to serve greed and ambition. As the night deepened, strange noises rose from the old house. The creaking of doors, the distant howl of a dog, and faint whispers that seemed to drift on the wind. Ebony's pulse matched the rhythm of the unsettling sounds. She thought of her father's guidance. Courage is measured not when the path is clear, but when shadows surround you. Huddled in the darkness, she reviewed her options. Confronting Tari openly would be suicide. Fleeing would mean losing the paper and letting injustice triumph. Remaining hidden was temporary, a pause before action, but she would need a plan. Each choice carried risk, each moment carried the weight of life and death. And yet, despite the fear, a fire burned within her. She was not merely a victim of deceit, she was the rightful heir, armed with truth and the weapon of evidence that Tari could not yet touch. The paper beneath her shawl felt alive, almost whispering to her, "Patience, Ebony. Wait for the right moment. Then justice will awaken." The night stretched long, thick with tension, as Ebony remained hidden among the shadows, knowing the village's eyes were watching. The Tari's lies were spreading, electric, and the time for reckoning was coming. That seemed almost
Every
alive.
rustle of wind,
Dark clouds had gathered over the village, reminded her that courage and cunning would be her only allies in the battle that awaited with the dawn. Low and ominous, shaking the walls of the ancestral home where Ebony had taken refuge. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drumming on the roof and flooding the narrow streets. It was as if the heavens themselves were conspiring to mirror the turmoil in her heart. Ebony sat cross-legged on the floor of her small quarters, the oilskin-wrapped papers beside her. She could hear the wind whipping through the trees, rattling the old shutters, and the distant barking of Tari's hounds. Sleep was elusive, her mind refusing to quiet itself. She thought of the trial that awaited her at dawn, of the false accusations that had spread through the village, and of the wicked cunning of her cousin. Fear gnawed at her, sharp and insistent, yet beneath it, a small flame of hope burned steadily. As exhaustion finally claimed her, she drifted into dreams. The storm outside seemed to enter her mind, winds howling through corridors of memory and emotion. Then, amidst the chaos, a familiar figure appeared. Her mother, radiant and calm, stepped forward, her presence cutting through the darkness. Ebony's breath caught. "My daughter," her mother whispered, her voice soft but firm, carried on the sound of the wind. "The truth does not burn, Ebony. It only reveals. Hold fast and do not falter." Tears welled in Ebony's eyes as she reached toward her mother, but the apparition remained just beyond her grasp, luminous and serene. "Father's will, the paper you carry, is more than ink and words. It is the voice of our family, the proof of what is right. Trust it, trust yourself, and the spirits will guide you. The storm raged on in the dream, yet it no longer frightened her. Each flash of lightning illuminated her father's carved insignia on the box, the red cloth binding the oilskin, the strength that had been entrusted to her hands. She felt a surge of courage unlike any she had known, a certainty that the justice long hidden would find its way. Ebony awoke to the sound of rain pounding the roof and the wind lashing against the walls. Her small quarters were dim, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. She pressed the paper closer to her chest, the words of her parents echoing in her mind. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm of injustice that Tari had unleashed, but now it felt like a signal, a warning, a protective presence. By dawn the storm had not abated. Villagers gathered in the central square, carrying umbrellas, baskets, and the weight of superstition in their hearts. Rumors of witchcraft had spread like wildfire, yet the storm's persistence made even the most skeptical pause. Rainwater pooled at their feet, soaking their feet and staining the earth, while thunder rolled overhead as if announcing the coming revelation. Tari arrived with a grim determination, his robes soaked, his hair plastered to his head, and his eyes scanning the crowd for signs of fear and obedience. He attempted to maintain his composure, raising his voice over the sound of the storm. "The girl is a witch," he proclaimed, gesturing toward Ebony. "She brings misfortune to our village. The elders must decide her fate." But the villagers hesitated. The sky, the wind, and the unrelenting rain had begun to instill a sense of awe. Even those who had long followed Tari's words felt a prickle of unease. The storm, they whispered among themselves, was unnatural, sent by forces beyond human control. Some clutched charms, others crossed themselves, and a few even murmured prayers to the ancestors. Ebony stood at the edge of the square, cloaked in a simple shawl, her heart steady. The paper of power lay hidden beneath her garments, pressed close to her chest. She could feel the weight of it and the protection it carried, the proof of her father's will, the evidence of Tari's deception, and the righteousness of her cause. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her face to the gathered crowd. She lifted her chin, meeting their gaze without fear. The storm had become her ally, a mirror of her resolve. Somewhere within the swirling rain and rumbling clouds, she felt the presence of her ancestors, their voices whispering in harmony with the wind. Justice will be done. The villagers waited, torn between superstition and the instinct to recognize truth. Tari's confident stance began to waver as the storm refused to relent, as if nature itself rejected his lies. In that charged morning, with rain soaking the earth and lightning illuminating the truth, the stage was set. Superstition and divine timing converged, and Ebony knew the moment of reckoning was finally at hand. The square was soaked, the muddy earth reflecting the gray light of the storm-laden sky. Villagers huddled under makeshift shelters, umbrellas, and the overhangs of their homes. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of fear, suspicion, and curiosity. Ebony walked steadily into the center, her feet slipping slightly on the slick ground, but her posture remained proud and unwavering. The paper of power, hidden beneath her shawl, pressed against her chest like a promise from her ancestors. The elders had gathered, seated in solemn authority, their faces grave and weathered. Some cast wary glances at Tari, who stood tall, his robes damp and heavy, a forced composure masking the nervous edge beneath. He had expected this trial to be a formality, a stage on which his version of reality would be affirmed. But the storm and Ebony's calm defiance had already begun to shift the mood of the villagers. Ebony approached the circle of elders, bowing slightly in respect, and spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd and the distant rumble of thunder. "I ask for the right to speak," she said, holding her head high. "I am Adewale's daughter, rightful heir to his estate, and I have evidence to prove the truth." Murmurs rose from the villagers, some skeptical, others intrigued. Tari's lips pressed into a thin line, his confidence faltering. "What proof could you have?" he demanded, stepping forward, his voice sharp, a mixture of anger and panic. "You bring only lies and superstition." Ebony lifted her shawl carefully, revealing the oilskin-wrapped papers. The crowd hushed, curiosity overriding fear. She untied the red cloth and spread the contents on the wooden platform where the elders sat. The first page, the will, gleamed faintly despite the rain and gloom. Each signature and seal was visible, crisp against the aged parchment. She gestured to the signatures. "This document is my father's true will, witnessed by elders of this village years ago," she said firmly. It names me as his sole heir and contains records of deceit, theft and illegal deals conducted by Tari. He has lied to you all, stolen what is not his, and accused me falsely of witchcraft to cover his crimes. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some villagers whispered to one another, while others stepped back, uncertain. A tense silence hung as one of the eldest men, Chief Alyamide, squinted at the document. His hand trembled slightly as he leaned closer. Recognition dawned in his eyes. This is my signature, he muttered, astonishment in his voice. I witnessed this will, decades ago. I remember every detail. The murmurs grew into louder whispers, then into a chorus of shock and outrage. Faces turned toward Tari, eyes narrowing, suspicion replacing admiration. He lied to us, one villager shouted. This is proof, another cried. Children peeked from behind their parents, sensing the sudden shift in energy. The wind seemed to intensify, rattling the crowd as if nature itself demanded justice. Tari's face paled. He lunged toward Ebony, hands outstretched, eyes desperate. Give me that paper, he barked, voice cracking. But the chief raised his hand, a single commanding gesture that froze him in place. Guards. Chief Alyamide's voice rang through the square. Seize him. He attempts to destroy evidence and obstruct justice. Take him into custody. 2 guards stepped forward, their spears poised, and Tari struggled, shouting and thrashing. The villagers gasped as he was restrained, his arrogance replaced by panic. Ebony stood still, her gaze unwavering, watching as the man who had stolen her inheritance and attempted to ruin her reputation was subdued. One elder leaned closer, voice shaking slightly with emotion. This is truth. The girl has been wronged. The will, the evidence, it all belongs to her. Justice demands we honor her father's intentions. The crowd erupted into whispers, then into applause, though subdued by awe and lingering fear of the storm. People came forward, some bowing to Ebony, others offering apologies for believing Tari's lies. The shift was palpable. Power had changed hands, but it was not by force, it was by truth. Ebony knelt briefly, touching the will to the platform where her father's name had once been honored. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow but of release and triumph. She had endured humiliation, false accusations, and betrayal, yet her courage, patience, and determination had brought the truth into the open. Tari struggled against the guards, pleading, shouting, but the villagers' eyes were no longer his to command. Each signature on the will, each document detailing his deceit, cemented the reversal of fortune. He had relied on fear, superstition, and manipulation, but truth, as Ebony's mother had said, only reveals itself when it is ready. The wind carried the sound of the villagers' voices, the storm seeming to recede as though satisfied. Ebony stood tall, the papers clutched in her hands. The inheritance that had been stolen, the honor that had been questioned, and the dignity that had been denied, all were now hers to reclaim. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. And in that moment, with the storm's fury softened and the village witnessing the unmasking of lies, Ebony felt a profound sense of rightness. She had not only survived deceit and betrayal, she had transformed it into vindication. The trial had ended, but her story, the story of courage, patience, and truth, would echo through the village for generations to come. The morning sun broke through the retreating storm clouds, casting a warm, golden glow across the village square. The air still carried the scent of rain and wet earth, but the oppressive weight of fear and suspicion had lifted. Ebony stood at the center, her posture calm yet commanding, holding the papers that had turned the tide of fate in her favor. The villagers, once whispering doubts and fearing her, now looked on with a mixture of awe and reverence. Tari had been escorted to the chief's courtyard under guard. His robes were disheveled, his arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by the unmistakable sheen of panic and regret. The evidence of his lies, the forged papers, illegal land deals, and stolen wealth, had been laid bare before the elders and the villagers alike. There was no question left. The truth was undeniable. Chief Alyamide addressed the crowd, his voice carrying over the square, firm yet fair. By the will of our ancestors and the laws of our village, the property and titles wrongfully claimed by Tari Adewale are hereby returned to their rightful heir, Ebony, daughter of our late Chief Adewale. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Some villagers gasped, some whispered prayers of gratitude, and others knelt, touching the ground in respect. The shame that had once accompanied Ebony, the mockery and subtle cruelty, was replaced with honor. Mothers whispered her name to their daughters, telling stories of courage and integrity, and men bowed slightly, acknowledging the justice that had finally prevailed. Abony stepped forward, her eyes meeting Tari's. He was seated, humbled and defeated, his face a mix of fury, disbelief, and an unspoken recognition of the consequences of his greed. The crowd pressed in, curious to see how she would act. Would she strike him down with the same venom he had used against her? Would she exact revenge for years of suffering, humiliation, and the theft of her family's legacy? But Abony's heart had been shaped by her parents' wisdom and the lessons of patience and restraint. She looked at him not with hatred but with measured resolve. Kneeling slightly, she retrieved a small pouch from her satchel and handed it to him. Inside were coins and a modest amount of land, a mere fraction of what he had claimed through deceit. "This is enough for you to live," she said, her voice calm yet carrying the weight of authority. "Enough to sustain yourself without harming others. Remember this, greed grows in empty hearts, not empty hands." The crowd was silent, stunned by her mercy. Many had expected public humiliation, harsh words, or retribution. Instead, Abony had chosen a path of justice tempered with compassion. Even Tari's expression softened, if only slightly, as he understood the depth of her magnanimity. She had not let bitterness dictate her actions. She had elevated justice above personal vengeance. With the formalities observed, the elders oversaw the ceremonial restoration of the ancestral lands to Abony. The main house, long neglected under Tari's rule, was handed back to her care. Old servants returned, some with tears in their eyes, others with quiet smiles, grateful to see the rightful heir reinstated. The fields that had been leased or sold illegally were reclaimed, and the boundary stones, once tampered with, were restored according to the true maps kept in the will. Abony walked through her reclaimed home, touching the familiar furniture, the walls that bore memories of her childhood, and the study where her father had once guided her hand in learning. She felt a sense of profound connection, a recognition that justice had not only restored property but had healed wounds far deeper than land or wealth. The house itself seemed to breathe again, as though acknowledging the presence of the true heir. Villagers began to approach her, offering apologies, congratulations, and support. Children peered at her with admiration, and elders nodded, acknowledging that truth and integrity had finally prevailed. Abony met them with grace, offering thanks but also encouragement. She spoke quietly, reminding them that courage, patience, and wisdom had brought this day, not anger, not vengeance. Even Tari, now humbled, had a place in this restored world, though limited and watched. Abony's decision to allow him a small portion of sustenance was a lesson in balance. Justice does not require cruelty, and mercy does not diminish authority. As the sun climbed higher, warming the village and drying the streets, Abony looked out over the fields, the houses, and the people she had always called home. The storm had passed, the lies had been revealed, and the rightful order restored. She felt the presence of her ancestors in the wind, in the rustling leaves, and in the steady rhythm of life returning to the village. In that moment she understood fully what her father had meant when he taught her that power is not in wealth alone, but in the strength to act rightly even when wronged. Abony's heart was steady, her spirit unbroken, and her legacy secure. She had turned the tables not with vengeance, but with truth and wisdom, proving that justice tempered with mercy could restore not only lands and titles but honor, dignity, and the faith of an entire village. Years passed, and the village transformed under Abony's careful guidance. The once tense air of suspicion and fear gave way to a sense of stability and trust. Fields flourished, homes were repaired, and the old market square buzzed with life and laughter. People spoke her name with respect, not merely because she had reclaimed her inheritance, but because of how she had done so, with wisdom, courage, and mercy. Tales of her courage spread to neighboring villages, whispered at first among women gathering water or tending to their children, then carried further by traders and travelers. Abony became known as the Keeper of Justice, a title that reflected not only her rightful claim to her family lands but also her unwavering dedication to fairness. She presided over disputes with a calm authority, balancing firmness with compassion. Villagers, once quick to believe in fear and superstition, learned to listen, to question, and to value truth above rumor. Under her guidance, the community grew stronger, united not by hierarchy or power, but by mutual respect and shared understanding. Mothers began to tell their daughters the story of Abony and the hidden paper that had changed everything. By firelight and in the shade of mango trees, they recounted how deceit and greed had threatened to destroy an entire family's legacy, and how one young woman had faced danger and fear to uphold the truth. They emphasized her patience in the face of injustice, her courage when accused of witchcraft, and her wisdom in choosing justice over vengeance. Children listened with wide eyes, some clutching dolls or bundles of cloth, imagining the courage it took to stand against betrayal and to hold fast to one's convictions. The oilskin-wrapped paper, once a secret, had become a symbol across villages. It was carefully preserved in a small ornate chest in Ebony's home, accessible to none but her and the trusted elders she had grown up with. People from distant lands came to witness it, not merely to see a document, but to understand the story it carried. A story of truth surviving the shadows of greed, deceit, and fear. The paper was no longer just evidence of inheritance. It was a lesson in the enduring power of integrity. As years turned into decades, Ebony continued to guide her people, her presence steady like the rising sun. She taught that courage was not the absence of fear but the ability to act rightly despite it, that patience could outlast the schemes of the greedy, and that wisdom required both listening and observation. Villagers respected her not because of her authority alone, but because her actions consistently mirrored the principles she espoused. Her leadership inspired a generation of women and men to act justly, to protect their communities, and to cherish truth over fleeting gain. Even Tari, now old and humbled, lived quietly on the small portion of land she had once granted him. He worked diligently, no longer seeking to manipulate or control, and while he never fully recovered the trust of the community, he remained a witness to the fairness and mercy that had shaped Ebony's reign. The lessons of her father's will, the guidance of her ancestors, and her own steadfast moral compass had transformed the cycle of deceit into one of restoration and learning. One morning, after overseeing the planting of the new harvest and resolving a minor dispute between two families, Ebony stepped outside to watch the sunrise. The horizon blushed with colors of gold, pink, and lavender, the first light spilling over the field she had reclaimed and nurtured. She inhaled the crisp air, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers, and for a moment, all the years of hardship and struggle seemed to settle behind her like a distant memory. Her heart was light, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and integrity. She thought of the hidden paper that had started it all, of the stormy night before her trial, and of the courage that had carried her through. It was more than a symbol of inheritance. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that truth, though it may be buried, never dies. As the sun rose higher, casting its warm glow across the village and illuminating the faces of the people who had become her extended family, Ebony smiled. She felt the presence of her parents in the gentle breeze, the approval of her ancestors in the rhythm of the day, and the quiet strength of justice in her own heart. In that peaceful moment, Ebony understood fully the legacy she had inherited and nurtured, not just of land or wealth, but of principles that would endure long after she was gone. Mothers would continue to tell her story, children would learn from it, and the paper, once hidden in shadows, would remain a testament to the enduring power of truth, patience, and courage. With the sun bathing the village in its golden light, Ebony stood in quiet contemplation, her face serene, her spirit untroubled. She had not only reclaimed what was hers but had transformed it into something far greater, a living legacy of justice, hope, and integrity that would echo through generations.